Hi, everyone. Welcome to our monthly webinar on trending beyond COVID-19. This is Karen O'Hara. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications at WorkCare and your host for today's session. Thanks so much for joining us. A lot of you are repeat visitors. We're always happy to see you. And if you're new, welcome to this first session. We are recording the session, and during the webinar, you'll be on mute. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. We also monitor chat, but I prefer if you could use the Q&A function. It's a little easier to make sure we don't miss any questions. The webinar recording will be posted on our YouTube channel, and a transcript of the Q&A segment will be posted on our website within the next few days. During the webinar, we'll share links to both the YouTube channel and the Q&A on the website. We have a full hour scheduled for today, and we should have plenty of time for your questions at the conclusion of Dr. Harris's remarks. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. As most of you know, Dr. Harris did a weekly webinar for a year, and now we've transitioned to this monthly format, and he continues to be our lead consultant for our COVID-19 response. Dr. Harris is MD, MBA, MPH. He's board certified in occupational medicine, and he's our Chief Innovation Officer. Now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Harris. Thanks again for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you, Karen, and thanks everyone for joining us once again. Obviously, there's a lot to discuss today. A lot of things have happened since we've last convened. And so we'll jump right into it. You know the topic for today. We're going to be talking about seasonal trends and the Omicron impact. Now, if you have not heard the terminology Omicron, it is pronounced Omicron, not Omicron. It comes from the Latin omni, right? But we want to talk about this variant, the impact of the variant, and what that may mean for our businesses, right? And we'll jump into that here right away. What we talked about leading up to today, a couple of things that we, were on the track for. Namely, we were talking about the cost analysis of COVID-19. So that's to be continued. We'll jump back to that once we distill what we know to be prudent for managing the workforce through Omicron and the holiday season. So stay tuned for that in the beginning of next year. But for today, let's jump into our topic. You know the format for today. It's the same as we've been doing on a monthly basis, talking about the clinical business case for your employers, for your employees, and then the causal examination of why we're making this recommendation in terms of keeping the workforce safe. We'll get into some thought leadership. What should we be holding in the front of our minds, right, in terms of potential impact and risks for our workforce and to our enterprise. And then as we talk about trends, we'll dive deeper into what we're seeing in the workplace, what we're seeing not just in the workplace, but also across the world and nation in terms of strategies to help mitigate what's to come. Mechanics of the fix we'll touch upon briefly. In this case, like we did last month, talk about what things are not going to be features of an easy fix for us here. And then finally, what messaging should be prominent for us as we move throughout the rest of this pandemic. So without further ado, we want to present the business case of reversal of COVID policies will likely be necessary now, right? So what are we talking about? We're talking about corporate mandates for mask wearing, social distancing, and hand hygiene, the things we all were accustomed to, months ago when the pandemic was at its peak, may be our reality again. And getting a head start on these measures to help mitigate risk for Omicron or against Omicron may be prudent for maximizing worker protection and helping protect our business continuity. So I know it's not what we want to be hearing right now. COVID fatigue, we know, is dramatic at this point amongst the workforce. Everyone's ready to be over and done with COVID-19, but unfortunately, that is just not our reality and may not be for some time to come. So we want to suggest to you all that start looking now, in it, even in advance of the ETS being either overturned or upheld, that a policy of mandating these measures in the workplace will be something that is prudent for you to do to help protect your workforce. And so let's get into the why aspect of it. And from a high level, right, this is our paradigm. COVID risk management is the name of the game. Tertiary prevention is what we talk about in terms of return to work, managing the workforce from an absentee standpoint. We won't be touching much on that today. We'll touch a little bit on secondary prevention, early interventions, and what strategies need to be in place to help with the colder months here in the US, as well as the presence of Omicron to come, and then really focusing in on what are the primary preventative steps that will be prudent for us moving throughout this season here. So if we look at what began the hoopla, right, even before the emergence of Omicron, we saw the UK trending up in cases as early as November, earlier in this November, right? And that spike in the UK came with the notion that UK was doing pretty darn good with their vaccine campaign. And we'll look specifically at that. But we saw this trending upward here at levels that were concerning from the perspective of what we saw in the UK last season, and it began sooner, right? And so the spikes in terms of cases and deaths, new cases and deaths, also obviously alerted health authorities in the UK, but also here in the US. And if we jump to looking now more globally, at boosters, we want to point this metric out because it's germane to what may come for us here in the US in comparison to the programs that have been in place in other nations and their experience with COVID, again, all being prior to the emergence of Omicron. Don't worry, we'll get into the details of Omicron and its features soon, but we want to, even before that, look at Israel. This was a couple weeks ago, right? November 13th, taking a snapshot here of where Israel was with their booster administration per 100 people compared to the UK, United States here, Italy, Germany is important to point out as well, because we want to now look at what transpired since November 13th in particularly Germany and a couple of these nations here. So looking at the share of population fully vaccinated, again, we can see where countries stood, Canada being up at the top, Italy, UK, Germany, right? US being fifth in this particular list behind Israel. So fully vaccinated, the definition being you've completed a full series, 2 shots of Pfizer or Moderna, or you've completed the Johnson & Johnson 1-shot dose. That's the definition we use here in the US. Obviously, that's consistent for international using those same vaccines. And as we look at Canada, Italy, UK, Germany, they were doing exceptionally well in terms of leading the pack with regard to both fully vaccinated and those who had received at least 1 dose of the vaccine, COVID-19 vaccines. And again, what's concerning is what we're going to talk about next, right? At the weeks leading up to today, we saw early spikes in Germany. You're familiar with that, very likely, beginning in October and certainly in November, right? And we saw this trend increase, not just in Germany, but also in the United Kingdom, right? What we just mentioned. And we saw this in Israel as well, right? If you see these tremendous spikes here of cases, again, all prior to the emergence of Omicron. So what does that mean for the US? You can see we had a wave here as well, but started trending back up a couple weeks ago. And fast forwarding to today, we can see that Germany has surpassed now UK in terms of cases, new cases. Reflecting back to Germany, again, their level of fully vaccinated in the 70s, as well as the UK, concerning, right? Because with regard to what is driving the onset of these new cases, obviously we know it's not Omicron yet, right? And so the mere fact that now there's ramifications in the UK as a result, and Germany, is something that's going to likely impact us here in the US, regardless of the performance of Omicron from a transmissibility and level of severity. And we'll talk about that here shortly. So when we look at the trend of what could be driving it, it could be seasonality, right? And we've certainly seen the seasonality of colder weather. This is Germany, Berlin, Germany, starting back in October, and temperature dropping almost 20, a little over 20 points here, right? And we know that that causes individuals to experience higher rates of exposure because of indoor exposure. And we want to be cognizant of that in terms of the impact here in the US. This is why we'll likely see spikes in the US. Again, population at levels of vaccination in the 70s with colder weather still experiencing spikes. And we're just now entering colder season, obviously in the northern states here in the US. And so if we look at Germany and single them out, they are the hardest hit for a country with high levels of vaccinations with new cases of COVID-19. Israel saw a dramatic drop here recently after being hard hit, again, higher than Germany, not the hardest hit right now as of today, but certainly cases per million. We see Israel, again, highly vaccinated population. They used Pfizer, just to recall, and had started their campaign of boosters 2 months ago, right? And we pointed that out in our lecture or our webinar when they changed their definition of what it means to be fully vaccinated to include a third jab, a booster. And that may be what we see as a result of their decline in cases, right? So we talked about, we're not going to show the slides, but we'll reiterate and talk about the statistics on boosters briefly here, just so we can understand what drove the trend downward for Israel and not for Germany and the UK that are still experiencing spikes. So Israel, again, changed the definition of fully vaccinated to include a booster, started boosting before most other countries, if not first to do so at scale. And the third dose increasing efficacy from 39%, looking at their data, up to 93%, right? And so again, if we're dissecting the trend and the causal nature of driving that trend, it may be the result of their success at boosters for the Israel. Now, if we look at Germany, UK, that's not the same picture because they have not pushed a booster redefinition at this point in time, but it's likely, right, with what they're experiencing. Canada, I'll point out Canada here. Let's look at Canada highlighted here, right? So Canada has maintained a lower rate of cases. They've been vaccinated again in the 70 at the level of 75% as of several weeks ago, fully vaccinated, right? But they did not experience the same spike or a similar spike that the UK and Germany had. So what could be the cause there in terms of their good performance against spikes? Obviously, we know it's cold in Canada, right? More cold than here in the US, and even more so than our neighbors across the pond. One thing that Canada has kept in place compared to other nations is the mask mandate. Their prime minister hadn't entertained relaxing the mask mandate until March of next year. So we know that Canadians still were compliant for the most part with wearing masks, and again, would be a reason why we don't see a similar spike in their case rate as it stands. So moving to then, United States, will we see a spike? Very likely. We'll support that with additional information here today as we continue the talk here. So when we jump into the trend and really dissecting further what's causing this trend and what's also causing the hoopla behind Omicron, we got to talk about and revisit genetic drifts and genetic shifts, okay? And unfortunately, the case is we'll likely experience the emergence of similar variants like Omicron for the next 5 years. If we're going back to what WHO leadership has iterated in terms of globally how we experience COVID-19, because of pockets of populations that don't have high vaccination rates. They'll be susceptible and have increased churn in terms of genetic drift and genetic shift. And so this is what Omicron looks like today. It will look like 2 weeks ago with the emergence, but looks like today in terms of spread of Omicron at this point, right? We know that Omicron emerged. All the news media points toward South Africa, right, being a location where Omicron emanated from. But we know that genetic tests or genetic samples were submitted by both Botswana, along with South Africa and Hong Kong, roughly the same timeline. That was back, estimates are November 4th was the earliest in cases that presented this new genetic profile, it being Omicron, the variant 11529, right? And so now we have it in multiple nations. We know it's in North America, and it's only a matter of time until we have enough genetic material samples from the US to demonstrate that it is here. FDA has increased in terms of trying to estimate Omicron in the US, has increased the amount of samples from 8,000 to 80,000 samples submitted to organizations like GIS-AID, where this data has come from, to help understand the profile of our new cases here from a genetic standpoint. So if we look at numbers and quantify numbers of samples received by GIS-AID, which is not, again, a summary of all the cases that are present in that nation, but only a reflection of a sample size from genetic profiling of positive cases. And you can see South Africa leading the way there, with Ghana, Botswana, and now obviously UK having a substantial burden now of Omicron, right? And so again, we know that Omicron is continuing to spread. We'll talk about the definition of what Omicron represents in terms of variant of concern here shortly. But at the end of the day, it comes down to this: the genetic makeup of Omicron. This is a pictorial of the genetic makeup of Omicron. And I want to point your attention to the orange region here. This orange region is that spike protein region. That's the region we've been talking about for the last 2 years, which is important for interaction of the virus and our antibodies, as well as the virus and entering our cells through the ACE2 receptor, okay? And this is why we're concerned about Omicron, because we're seeing the most genetic mutation out of all the variants we've seen previously. The fact that these genetic mutations are labeled in this orange region is a testament to our understanding of how these genetic mutations will affect the performance or the phylogeny of the virus itself. Meaning that this virus mutation is likely to do a couple things. One, evade our immune system, meaning it won't bind to our antibodies well. Two, and that's both with regard to natural immunity and acquired immunity, meaning natural, I've been infected with COVID and I've recovered, and acquired immunity, I've been vaccinated and have antibodies in my system. Two, it has telltale marks through the mutations of being more easily transmissible. Three, it has telltale marks similar to other variants that we saw that would lead to more severe illness, right? And so again, very concerning from that standpoint. And the green the green depiction here is the protein binding complex for our ACE2 receptors, okay? And I'll mention it now. We're going to geek out here for a second, all right? So bear with me. But What this represents, right, is from a Dr. Harris perspective, something we've talked about before, the antibody dependent enhancement, ADE, right? This may represent the greatest risk for that phenomenon to happen. As you may recall, ADE is a process by which the virus doesn't bind tightly or well enough to our antibodies for our antibodies to actually eliminate the virus itself. And as a result of that weak binding, it may usher the virus into our immune cells, macrophages, and allow that virus to multiply in a cell that it normally would not. And that causes an increase in magnification of viral load, and that may lead to not just increased spread, but potentially increased disease. Again, we see ADE happen in viral illness such as dengue, where you get dengue once, you recover with mild symptoms. If you get dengue twice, you may suffer from dengue hemorrhagic fever and die, right? So we haven't seen any objective telltale evidence thus far that ADE is happening as a result of Omicron. But again, we're still early in the process of understanding its impact from both a severity as well as transmissibility perspective. Again, first cases arose estimate on November 9th, or 4th rather, and there is a timeline in terms of onset of severe illness, particularly with the onset of illness and population that Omicron first emerged, which were university students in South Africa. University students being a younger population, we would expect that disease would be milder in those individuals to begin with. So as this spreads and we have infections in older populations, at-risk populations with pre-existing conditions, we may see a very different picture in terms of impact of Omicron from a severity and transmissibility standpoint. So with that being said, what should we expect in terms of cases due to Omicron from a macro picture? It really begins with the WHO's meeting and designation of Omicron as a variant of concern, right? In the definition in and of itself, we can begin to understand the potential risks here for Omicron from a global pandemic perspective, right? We haven't had a variant of concern since Delta, right? And we know obviously that Delta is still the predominant, by far and away, over 99% of all new cases globally are Delta variants, right? And so when we talk about the definition of variant of interest and variant of concern, we can see straightforward that because of genetic mutations with regard to variants of interest, we're seeing viral characteristics of increased transmissibility or severity, right? Immune escape is something that is concerning from the perspective of diagnostic and therapeutic escape, also concerning. That's just with variant of interest. Again, jumping down to variant of concern, we see the difference between interest and concern is one of observation of the potential, right, for impact, and then variant of concern, we're seeing evidence of impact play out in communities around the world. And so transmissibility is likely to be increased because we're seeing spread. Virulence is probably increased because we're seeing that presence of disease, or the effectiveness of our ability to have social measures against from a diagnostic and vaccine therapeutic standpoint is affected. Unfortunately, we're seeing a little bit of all three of these potentially here with Omicron, and we'll digest this a little bit further in terms of impact, right? And so the variant, as I mentioned, has the most mutations that we've seen, and we know that diagnostically, PCR can still, as far as we know, detect Omicron, right? And that's how we've detected it thus far. 2 out of the 3 gene targets utilized typically in PCR are positive, right? And when we see this telltale sign of 2 out of the 3, it's called gene dropout and target failure, then those assays are typically sent for genetic profiling to understand, is it truly Omicron? Unfortunately, at this point in time, there's still research ongoing to understand whether or not rapid antigen tests can detect Omicron. So we'll speak to what impact that may have for our strategy corporate-wide moving forward. If we look now at predictions We know and can see that CDC has not yet changed their prediction of increased cases as a result of Omicron. It's kind of like politics, right? At the last hour, too early to tell is the case here with Omicron in terms of impact. So we are likely to see CDC update their forecast once we have more data in terms of the extent of spread of Omicron, not just in the US, but obviously as the global data continues to come in. However, we can look at trends to try to understand what the impact may be from an Omicron standpoint, as well as our continued case rate from other variants such as Delta. So if we look back to the colder months from last year, right? So we're looking from November, in this case, mid-November to February, we can see that we had a tremendous burden, not just here in the US, but across the Northern Hemisphere in those colder months. And so again, we do expect this trend to play out here moving forward. Again, particularly here in the US, right? It's almost unavoidable. And adding to that, this period of time last year was during a period of time in which most states still had some level of mask mandate in place. So fast forward to now, where we know that many states don't have a mask mandate and jurisdictions do not. We're going to be in a scenario of, yes, having vaccinated individuals, but having close proximity for the holidays with no masks in place. And obviously, that represents a potential for increased risk with or without Omicron being a primary driver for those infections. Now, if we do see emergence of Omicron prior to the Christmas holiday here, expect an even greater impact in terms of spikes in the community, all right? And that translates into increased risk for workplace transmission. Hence, going back to our original recommendation of the business case, getting ahead of mandates from a mask and social distancing standpoint may be prudent to help protect your workforce and keep business continuity in good shape during the holiday season. All right. And so if we try to look at other metrics to compare and estimate what our impact may be year over year, this is what we want to look at, right? So this is data that looks at, is there a fifth wave coming, right? And so we're comparing cases of 2020 over this time period, January to October, to 2021 cases. And you can see in the blue highlighted here, higher cases at those given times, again, compared to last year, year over year. So the fact that we've already had a wave prior to the wave that we saw last year may mean that we're in store for equal or even perhaps worse scenario if indeed the Omicron variant does not hold up or can escape our antibodies from vaccination, right? And we'll touch upon that reality here shortly. But again, looking at the number of deaths with the similar lens here, we can see excess of last year where we were higher. And again, in the latter months here, we saw an increase prior to the onset of cold this year in comparison. So winter may bring, again, a higher spike or equal to last year, even with our vaccinated population. All right. So at the end of the day, should we keep preparing for the ETS and why? Right. And so we'll look at trends here that will impact this decision making. Straight away, we can see that there is evidence from the legal community that employers should maintain their preparation, right? And that's what legal experts have said. We know that some employers are in a wait and see approach, right? As litigation continues with regard to the Sixth Circuit and in regards to whether or not this will go to the Supreme Court, which everyone is kind of estimating it might, right? Then we want to understand what is best practice for protecting the workforce, one, and then two, what parts of the ETS may be altered, right? As we prepare and try to understand better ETS, and we'll get into that a little bit further here. So you've probably seen this as of yesterday. If you haven't, it's not great news, right? This is the CEO of Moderna, and he has said that their vaccines will likely be much less effective at combating Omicron than against the Delta variant. Okay, and this is what we anticipated, unfortunately, because of the vast mutations of Omicron. But now it's being substantiated by the pharmaceuticals that it's likely we will need a different formulation that is specific to variants that are emerging in order to maintain our efficacy against these variants. And so, what does that mean? Obviously, that means that our timeline for protecting the workforce from a vaccination standpoint is truncated. If Omicron becomes prominent in the US, we don't know the number yet in terms of efficacy, but let's just assume that efficacy against Omicron with Moderna and Pfizer will be after, taking it to a even conservative approach, right? We saw with Delta 6 months after being fully vaccinated, evidence that the vaccine was only 39% effective, right, at preventing a symptomatic spread. We can assume that against Omicron, it's going to be far less than that, right? And again, at that low level of efficacy, it's going to be very concerning from a workplace transmission, not just those who were vaccinated previously, but those who are unvaccinated in terms of risk for severe illness. Okay, and we'll touch on, are there solutions for severe illness? Perhaps, but we'll speak to those here shortly. So when we talk about then, real quick here, he said there's no world, there is no world, I think, where effectiveness is the same as Delta, right? And that's just as blatant as anyone can mention. So again, peering into what's next for us in terms of boosters, 100 days is the timeline in which pharmaceuticals said they can have a new formulation that is specific for the variant. But again, 100 days from now poses a conundrum for individuals who are seeking to get their booster now because it's been 6 months since their full vaccination. And we know there's a population of the workforce in that scenario. So briefly, I'll speak to that. Don't have a slide for it, but let's play that out from a thought experiment standpoint, from a clinical perspective, right? If we're looking at a booster availability that's effective against Omicron, roughly 3 months from now, right? And you're looking at getting your booster because you're due now and your efficacy against Delta may be as low as 39% now. Should you go ahead and get the booster now and then wait another 6 months before you're eligible for another booster, right? That's the thought experiment. The answer to that is yes, perhaps, right? Because either way, you're going to have a 3-month window in which you will likely have increased risk of transmissibility or transmission, right? Or let's say increased risk of susceptibility. So what do I mean by that? If you hold off getting your booster now and wait until 3 months from now to get the updated Omicron efficacious booster, you will have a 3-month period in which your susceptibility to Omicron will be substantial, obviously, right? In that timeline, however, right, to the contrary, if you get your booster now, your efficacy against Delta goes back up to 93%. And then you have a 3-month window on the back end of waiting another 6 months to get your updated booster against Omicron. So by virtue of getting your booster now, you minimize your risk of Delta, which is still, we know, the predominant strain or predominant variant, and you only have a decreased window to 3 months against Omicron. Whereas if you wait to get your booster until the new booster is out, then you're susceptible to both Delta during that longer time period of 6 months or 3 months from now, and obviously awaiting that period to get your efficacy against Omicron. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of the logic behind that clinically. And we would recommend then flat out, if you're looking to get boosted, a booster because you're due for that 6 months prior to your 6 months from your previous vaccination, go ahead and get that booster, right? And that will be a lower risk scenario for you, particularly if you have pre-existing conditions. So when we look at the headlines, right, we want to flash back to this. Coronavirus, authorized coronavirus rapid antigen detection. This we know happened May of last year. And since then, as with improvements in efficacy of these tests, we've been seeing more and more rapid antigen a part of our corporate strategy to protect the workforce. It makes sense. It's in the ETS in terms of you're able to use rapid antigens tests to be compliant from a weekly testing standpoint. But the impact of Omicron now is such that we don't know whether or not rapid antigen tests will be efficacious at detecting Omicron, right? And so that should play a considerable thought process into your corporate strategy. Unfortunately, the future of this is still about probably 10 days away from us understanding and having enough data, potentially longer, on whether or not the majority of antigen tests, which look for the most part, the nucleocapsid of the virus, can still detect Omicron with the mutations that it represents. Okay. So again, so far, as we know and we've seen, PCR still detects Omicron. But again, I mentioned this so that you consider where you spend your capital dollars and how you formulate your strategies to help protect your workforce germane to the ETS, right? Will we likely see a redefinition of the ETS guidelines in terms of what tests are applicable? Again, at this point, any EUA approved test is applicable and satisfactory from an ETS standpoint, but we don't know if that's going to change if we have evidence that PCR is the only way to detect it. Now, what's the trend that is leading us to potentially that inevitability? Let's look at the UK. What did they do? They mandated PCR tests for travelers landing in the UK, and it has to be within 2 days. And if you're not negative status, you have to quarantine. So the fact that they did not allow rapid antigen tests is a testament to our lack of understanding of the sensitivity and specificity for rapid antigen detection of Omicron. So when we talk about the fix, right, we want to quickly review as we're approaching the 40-minute mark here in our talk, what interventions will not likely be helpful for us moving forward. We thought weeks ago, right, we were going to see the emergence of this Merck drug, Malnupiravir, and its emergence be a strong intervention here for us, for individuals to prevent hospitalization and severity from COVID-19. And in fact, that early data looked great. We presented it last month, 50% reduction in the population of 755 individuals, right? And it was so positively telling in this trials that they stopped the recruitment prematurely. And they said, we have enough data, let's move forward with a submission to FDA. Since then, there's been a number of things that has happened. Namely, we have updated data just this week, or last week rather, that the efficacy is down to 30%. And what happened? We got data back from about 1,400 patients rather than just the 755 previously, right? And so now that dramatic drop in efficacy is concerning from an approval standpoint. Again, medication is still not approved by FDA. Another concern is that this drug is utilizing a novel pathway to eliminate COVID-19 by introducing genetic mutations, basically, to the code of the virus itself. And there is concern that this medication may cause birth defects because of its impact to genetic material. So again, there were some very good, hopeful positives about the medication, but now those have been kind of negated by the lower efficacy and some of the risks, which questions whether or not it will get approved through FDA. Now, we don't have slides on it today, but briefly touching on Pfizer's effort, much more positive results there. Pfizer's medications similarly looked at 755 individuals. Then we got data back for over 1,000 and their efficacy has held up over an 89% efficacy with a similar dosing schedule within 5 days of a positive result or onset of symptoms. Individuals who take the Pfizer medication can experience a 89% decrease in risk for hospitalization and severity and death by that means as well. So we'll look to see if FDA approves Pfizer prior to Merck, and that may be an intervention that helps many, particularly with the emergence of Omicron. We'll see if their medication is effective against Omicron as well. And just to point out, not geeking out too much, but the mechanics of both of the medications are different, right? The Pfizer, we'll glaze through this. This is the Merck data showing that lower efficacy to 30% I already mentioned. So in the interest of time, we'll move past this. But real quick, the mechanism of the Pfizer, not as concerning from a side effect profile as the Merck, because the Pfizer medication uses protease inhibitors. We talked about that last month as well, I believe, briefly. And protease inhibitors have been used in the treatment successfully of HIV and other illnesses, viral illnesses. And so it looks much more promising as an intervention that may be effective for us clinically to combat COVID. So let's clarify as we wind towards the end and hopefully getting to some good questions here. Let's clarify a couple of things in terms of our messaging around ETS for you, the employers, not necessarily this time messaging to the employees, but we want to look at one, COVID is here to stay. We know this, right? Omicron is just a recent example of that. And two, what are the unknowns? What are some of the high level unknowns about the ETS that we can clarify and unpack a little bit more? 1910-501 is the rule here in terms of clarification, right? And so just briefly here, a couple of verification from a vaccination standpoint, do's and don'ts, right? From a record keeping standpoint, there is a question out there of, are these records considered HIPAA? HIPAA, it needs to be HIPAA compliant in terms of employers storing this data, right? And the answer in the law itself, right, in the rulemaking itself, is that it needs to be to the level of 1910-1020, which is not HIPAA, right, but needs to be considered a medical record that is controlled by the employer, okay? And so it's a different set of criteria other than HIPAA. So we're not talking about HIPAA compliant data. We are talking about, though, the same level of category of data as you would a fitness for duty and receiving medical records in that regard. That level of precaution needs to be in place. That level of structure needs to be in place to maintain these vaccination records. One nuance that we've seen or heard from employers is a de-identification of vaccination status and or testing results from an individual's, let's call it identification status, right? So if you have these records in a system, can they be de-identified and only matched up when needed for record-keeping purposes? And the answer to that looks like that is still compliant as long as you can come back and show and demonstrate individual records for the workforce that is subject to the ETS, okay? And if we have more questions, I'm happy to answer that after our talk here. From a proctoring standpoint, there's still a lot of confusion around this. And so I want to clarify this for everyone here. What tests require proctoring and what tests don't? So per the ETS, again, here in black and white, if it's not both self-administered and self-read, right, then a telehealth proctor or an authorized proctor that can be on site is not necessary. So rapid antigen tests that are self-collected and self-read need to be proctored. Tests that fall into the category that don't need to be proctored are, for example, PCR tests. They can be self-collected, but they're going to go to a laboratory for that specimen to be analyzed. Anything sent to a laboratory for analysis does not require per-ETS proctoring. Okay, so I just wanted to nip this one in the butt because we still get questions around what tests require proctoring. And obviously with the emergence of Omicron and the uncertainty around rapid antigen tests, we want to, let you know that rapid antigen tests require proctoring, but may not even be a strategy for us moving forward if Omicron, again, is a substantial impact globally here for us from a numbers standpoint, okay? And at the end of the day, it comes down to following the trend of what's happening in Europe, that's likely to happen here in the US. Mask mandates are back in place in Europe, right? As of this week, the prime minister said that. And again, I mentioned the other restriction that was back in place, mandatory PCR testing for travelers into the country, right? And so we want to look at this trend and see, is that a trend that we're likely to follow here in the US? Obviously, we've already had restrictions, travel restrictions placed for several nations, including the South Africa and surrounding nations. We've seen Israel already lock down their borders, 100%, no international travel for Israel. And so this is moving us back towards where we were previously at the peaks of COVID-19. And because of Omicron, because of the trend upward with the seasonality, I do believe it would be prudent, one, to stay ahead of the trend and consider requiring the masks, social distancing precautions in the workplace, and that's regardless of the vaccination status, because we've seen the spikes in highly vaccinated countries and populations, and it can happen here. And we'll demonstrate this over the weeks here when we talk about this in January, okay? So these are the things we want you to be cognizant of. I also want to put in a quick plug. If you want to go a little bit further with us here coming up, I will be on a National Safety Council panel looking specifically at response and future work. It's a virtual summit that is hosted free, complimentary by National Safety Council. The time and date here, you can see December 9th, 2:15 p.m. to 3:15 Central. Join us for this, and you can learn more about trends and safety topics around COVID from a national and international perspective with the awesome panels that we have throughout the day. So with that, I'll stop. We got about 13 minutes here for questions, so let's get into it. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Harris. We'll jump right into the questions. There's a couple people who are wondering if you have a rapid test that uses an app that confirms with analytics on a phone or with an app, if that would be something that would not require a proctor.
If the results of the rapid test is analyzed and reported in an automated fashion, then that would meet the definition of not being self-read and would, from my interpretation of the rulemaking here, not be subject to proctoring. Now, if it requires an input from the user or from the employee into the app, that still is a scenario of self-read. So it is based on automation, which would fall under the auspices of analysis.
Okay. While you were talking, and this morning, we learned that the first case of Omicron has been detected in California. So that's number one. How many cases do you think need to emerge within the coming weeks before we know with some degree of certainty how prevalent it's going to become?
So I think for this variant of concern, right, it is definitely following a similar trend to Delta. And if we've learned from Delta, right, that Delta overtook as the number one variant in our positive cases over a matter of mere weeks, right? And so I anticipate that Omicron is likely to do the same because of the mutations that it has that are similar to Delta, which is why it took the WHO only less than 48 hours to declare it a variant of concern after they received the sample on the 24th. On the 26th, they had already met and said it's a VOC. So that trend from Delta, what we've learned from Delta, is being followed by Omicron.
Okay, we'll take the questions, some other questions in the order we received them. The CDC recommends getting a booster 6 months after completion of full vaccination. What are the consequences to employees who wait longer than 6 months to get their booster? At what point should they be considered unvaccinated or at increased risk? This also relates to another question about when do we think the CDC will change its definition of fully vaccinated? And any idea on the timing of that?
Indeed, indeed. So, as far as the letter of the definition, as long as you received a full series, 2 of Pfizer, 2 of Moderna, or 1 of Johnson and Johnson, then you are considered. And for the ETS purpose, it's any WHO approved vaccine. I want to make that clear too, that for compliance with ETS, an international vaccine approved by WHO is compliant. But from the perspective of fully vaccinated, it's completing that. There's no association of risk with the definition of fully vaccinated. All right, those are kind of decoupled. Whereas if you wait longer than 6 months, your risk is going to go up in terms of risk of susceptibility, but your status will still be considered until CDC redefines it fully vaccinated. From a clinical standpoint, however, right, let's use the definition that FDA has promulgated to provide EUA status to a vaccine. That level of efficacy is 50%. So if the vaccine was less than 50%, it would not receive emergency use authorization. So in terms of efficacy. So let's use that clinically to define someone's clinical status as vaccinated, unvaccinated. I would suggest that anybody who has a susceptibility lower than 50% would be considered clinically unvaccinated, okay? Again, we'll see what CDC and FDA say about redefining that definition. I believe timeline-wise, it's gonna happen after we have a verdict on the either being upheld or overturned the ETS, because the ETS itself has baked into it the definition of fully vaccinated. They would have to amend the legislation in order to not have incongruency between what is recommended by CDC and defined as fully vaccinated versus legislatively what is considered fully vaccinated. So it won't be until we have some resolution of the ETS that I believe CDC would move to a redefinition, which may put us in a really bad shape, right? If we look at the data, we're at 19.1, just over 19.1 of individuals in the US who are fully vaccinated having received their booster already. That goes up dramatically, 65 and older, right? But so far, we're not making great segue into getting people boosted. And that may be problematic for us in terms of how we experience Delta continually. And obviously with Omicron may be a tremendous impact if the boosters prove to be poorly efficacious against that one.
Okay. I feel like it reminds me of a saying in Southeast Asia where it's same, but different. And here we are approaching year 2 of the pandemic and, you know, a whole new ball game kind of. Interesting.
Yeah, if I'm being a little jocular, I mean, this is like Groundhog's Day, you know? I mean, it from a pandemic standpoint, and I'm hopeful that we'll catch a break and, you know, one of the vaccines will be more efficacious than we're expecting. Because honestly, that's going to be the only way we really get to the other side of this pandemic. We know that because of availability of vaccinations globally, we're going to have pockets of people at scale susceptible, and we'll have continual mutations that promulgate from those populations, susceptible populations. And there's even some theorized forecasts that a poorly effective vaccine may hasten the emergence of variants that are resistant, right? And we see that certainly with genetic changes in bacteria and antibiotics becoming more resistant in that scenario. And we can potentially see that with vaccines for viruses.
Okay. Well, let's jump back into the questions. It's a lot to get into. Diane asks, comments first and then asks, we don't hear much anymore about asymptomatic transmission. Is this still an issue with the Delta and other variants?
It is. We know asymptomatic cases still occur. Because of the level of positivity rates that we have for COVID, we don't hear about it as much anymore. You're right, but it's still a concern, right? If we look at the evolution of the virus with the different variants, I believe because of the increased severity that we saw with first the UK variant, and then obviously with Delta having similar features, the symptomatic pool of asymptomatic affected individual population has decreased in percentage. Now, I haven't seen any data to objectively substantiate that conjecture. However, anecdotally, I believe that's what we're seeing, and it's a result of the virus becoming more virulent from a severity standpoint. And I think Omicron will fit in that bucket as well.
Okay, next question. With the increase of vaccinations, how do we explain the greater number of cases in 2021 versus 2020?
Yes, it is a function, we believe, of efficacy decline of the vaccine and behavioral change of the population. One thing we haven't talked about in a little bit, several lectures, is the metric of the population and transportation, or basically movement, mobility, right? Remember, we looked at Google's data. We also looked at Apple's data on the mobility of people in the US and globally. And we saw that as mobility increased, transmission risks went up, or transmission rates went up, right? And again, if we distill it back to the definition of R naught, or reproductive rate, a component of that equation is proximity, right? And so as you have more people changing their behavior, becoming in closer proximity to others, because of vaccination status, right, we're increasing the risk for transmission disproportionate to the effectiveness of the vaccine itself, thereby potentially increasing our overall experience of cases from a positivity standpoint.
Okay, is it reasonable to continue to use rapid tests until Omicron is become more prevalent in the US and we have more information about the ability of rapid tests to detect it?
Absolutely. We strongly advise you to continue to use the armamentarium you have available. We wanted to just caution you that the future in the US and abroad of leveraging rapid antigens may change. As of today, again, 98%, 99% of all cases are Delta, will be detected with efficacious. I'll mention it. Not all rapid antigen tests are equal, right? We still know the sensitivity and specificity vary. But for the most part, the ones that have been approved and efficacious can be still very much effective at doing surveillance. And if nothing else, confirm in cases where you have a positive with PCR, so that we have the opportunity to articulate, is that positive case likely to need sequencing to see if it's Omicron. So I would urge that for the greater good of our understanding from an epidemiologic standpoint.
Okay, we have time for maybe 1-2 more questions. Does a booster make the host more prone to antibody-dependent enhancement if then exposed to Omicron?
No, in theory, it should make the host less susceptible to an ADE scenario. Here's why. ADE happens with there's 3 different pathways for the inevitability of ADE, but 2 kind of scenarios that set you up for it. 1, your antibodies don't bind well enough to the virus to eliminate it. 2, you don't have enough antibodies in your system to effectively neutralize the virus. So the booster addresses both in a way. We see that after a third boost, Pfizer, Moderna, your immune response is far greater than after your completion of the 2 series dose, and the efficaciousness again goes back up to 93%. That means you have more effective circulating antibodies at a higher volume, right? Those 2 scenarios would reduce your risk, in theory, of ADE. Now, enter Omicron, right? That will present a scenario in which weakly binding antibodies from a booster may still present risk for ADE, but it may not be necessarily greater than if you had not received the booster to begin with. Because if you are fully vaccinated, you still have antibodies circulating in your system, and they're at a level of efficacy lower, in theory, volume-wise, than prior to your booster. But again, attaching that to a risk for ADE, it shouldn't be a straight line equation, if you would. So whether you've been boosted or not, having antibodies in your system that weakly bind Omicron may still present an equal or roughly equal risk for ADE. Again, I don't want people to walk away saying, oh crap, we're at risk for ADE based upon what I said, because we still don't have any objective data research to demonstrate that ADE is occurring as a result of Omicron. I only pointed out to try to prognosticate based upon the mutations of the virus itself, the risk, the potential risk being greater as a result of Omicron's phenotype or genotype versus Delta or other variants that we've seen.
Okay, well, we're out of time. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to all the questions, but for those of you who didn't get your questions asked, we will address them. Just check back on our website. I send them to Dr. Harris, he answers them, and then we post them and add them to the transcription that we do. So just be patient for that. And we'll look forward to having you back on January 5th, 2022. So we'll see you next year. Thanks again for joining us. And thank you so much, Dr. Harris. As always, we really appreciate all your knowledge and insights.
Well, we thank almost 180 of you for joining. We wish you safety and a wonderful holiday, and let us know how we can be helpful to you as we continue through this pandemic. Take care and God bless.
We'll be here. Happy holidays.